I said to my Democratic caucus colleagues yesterday that I will veto a bill that comes to my desk. My main message to Congress at this point is just hold your fire. Nobody around the world, least of all the Iranians, doubt my ability to get some additional sanctions passed should these negotiations fail.
Mr. Prime Minister, I understand you've been making phone calls to senators on this issue of the Iran sanctions bill. Is that correct? Are you actually lobbying the U.S. Congress on this?
To answer you very directly, yes. I have contacted a couple of senators this morning, and I may speak to one or two more this afternoon, but simply to make the point that further sanctions or further threat of sanctions at this point won't actually help to bring the talks to a successful conclusion.
Well, the British Prime Minister making calls to senators, the President saying Congress should hold their fire on new sanctions as this Iran deal is still in the works. Let's start there, bring in our panel. Steve Hayes, senior writer for the Weekly Standard. Julie Pace, White House correspondent for the Associated Press, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Julie, I think it was in Washington surprising to hear a prime minister essentially lobbying senators on behalf of the administration.
It was extraordinary. I've actually never heard of that happening before. It tells you how seriously the U.S., the U.K., and their negotiating partners take this threat of sanctions from Capitol Hill. They say even if the president could veto the legislation, and it's unclear whether Congress could get a veto-proof majority on this, even if he could veto them, the mere act of Congress passing this bill in the middle of this delicate diplomacy could just blow up the negotiations. They feel like they are at a point where they are negotiating in good faith with the Iranians. They feel like, again, it's maybe a 50-50 prospect of getting a deal, but even a 50-50 prospect is better than having the negotiations at this point implode.
It's interesting. Senator Bob Menendez from New Jersey, a Democrat, here he is talking to James Rosen earlier about this very back and forth.
The Iranians don't believe that there's a credible use of force on the table. I think what's happened, unfortunately, with events with ISIL leads them to believe that there is a resurgence in their importance in the region, and so that's problematic.
So, Steve, essentially they're saying there needs to be some kind of thing that says, hey, Iran, we're serious, right. Hanging on the table. If the deal falls apart, boom, yes. It's ready to go.
Exactly. I mean, Julie very accurately described the way that the administration has been making its case. But in fact, the opposite of what the administration argues is true. It would give them immensely more leverage if the president could turn, or John Kerry could turn to Zarif and say, look, we've got these crazies back there in the United States in both parties, and if I accept, a bum deal for the United States, you're going to be hit with all these sanctions, and I can't even control what they're going to do. I mean, it gives the administration a lot more leverage. But I think there were two exchanges that were very interesting today on these issues. One was the one that you just showed with David Cameron, who said, in effect, yes, I'm calling senators to urge them not to do this, but I'm not lobbying them. I'm just letting them know that we don't need it, which is preposterous. I mean, it's silly on its face. And the second came at the State Department between the spokesman there and a reporter from the Associated Press who said, in effect, was asking about the nuclear reactors that Iran announced earlier this week, and said, well, isn't this problematic? And the person says, well, it didn't violate, the State Department spokesman said, well, it doesn't violate the interim agreement. And the reporter says, well, so you're saying you're not concerned? He said, well, no, I didn't say I wasn't concerned. We might be concerned. Just a silly sort of backpedaling from the administration, seeming to want to give Iran, in my view, every benefit of every doubt at every question.
Yeah, you're talking about President Rouhani earlier saying that Iran will continue to build these two nuclear plants, and at the same time saying that Iranian prosecutors will indict and have indicted a detained Washington Post reporter. Those announcements came as the negotiations, by the way, Charles, were continuing in Geneva. The president today said, hey, listen, if I want sanctions, I can get sanctions from this Congress, but let's make this at least a chance.
Look, what he said is really remarkable. He says, nobody doubts that I have the ability to get new sanctions. True, but nobody in the world believes that he has the willingness to get new sanctions. That's the reason why Congress wants to pass them now to be triggered, not to be imposed now, but to be triggered if the negotiations don't succeed. So it gives the U.S. leverage over Iran. Obama says, don't worry if the negotiations don't succeed. I can get sanctions. But he has shown right through the years in these negotiations that he has resisted sanctions at every turn. The initial set of sanctions that really weakened the regime and hurt the economy and cut the value of the rial in half, that brought Iran to the table, Obama resisted tooth and nail. Congress had to pass them over his objection. And then he starts these interim negotiations, starting by relaxing the sanctions, which is a disincentive for Iran to go ahead and negotiate, and says if this doesn't succeed in the 6-month limit, we will or we can reimpose new sanctions. He doesn't do it. Instead, he extends negotiations. It runs out again, he extends it a second time. Nobody, including the Iranians, has any faith in the fact that he will actually impose sanctions. The Iranians know that, and that's why they understand he's negotiating out of weakness and desperation.
You know, on the first go-through, Charles, the president said, we haven't taken anything off the table. If these negotiations fail, you know, it's very forceful. Second time around, our former colleague, Major Garrett, asked, so wait a second, does this mean that a war footing happens if the negotiations fail? And he said, no, let me be clear. That's not the case.
What he's telling the Iranians is, I'm exerting no leverage over you. Everything is off the table. I'm trying like hell to get an agreement that you will support and that I can sell as a fig leaf. Look at his success in negotiations with the Russian reset, and look at how much he got out of Castro by normalizing. This is a guy who doesn't understand or believe in leverage, and the results have reflected exactly that.
Julie, I want to turn to the terrorist threat, and they're talking about it. Take a listen to how both leaders talked about it.
We do face a very serious Islamist extremist terrorist threat. It means countering this poisonous, fanatical death cult of a narrative that is perverting the religion of Islam.
This phenomenon of violent extremism and strategies to counter violent extremism. With respect to violent extremism, my impression is that Europe has consistently taken this seriously.
It was kind of interesting to watch.
It was. I was saying earlier that I kept going back into my story to keep updating with new David Cameron quotes because he just kept... Death cult. I mean, he was really saying some pretty extraordinary lines, and when you listen to them in contrast with what the president was saying and what other White House officials have been saying this week, it was very clear that the strategies are different here. You know, the White House will explain this by saying that they don't want to give people who are Muslims a reason to think that they're associating Islam with terrorism. They don't want to justify the rationale of people who carry out these attacks. In some ways, though, they're sort of creating a story where they don't have to create a story. Islamic extremism is a word that they have used before, other administrations have used before. It's not totally off the wall to say that. So they're kind of providing fodder where they don't really have to here.
See?
Well, at every turn, on both policy and language, the administration, I think, has sought to downplay the threats from Islamic extremists. We're seeing the president do it here. The rhetoric follows the policy.
It isn't just a logical absurdity of refusing to use the word and to speak the truth. Just look at the passion that Cameron had talking about this and Obama's sort of insouciance about this. I mean, you look at the two leaders, you don't have to be a psychiatrist to figure out who truly cares about this and it burns over this. And I think it reflects the policies that emerge from the various leaders.
Insouciance. And George Will is not even here.
But I did it in honor of our visit to Paris by our secretary. If he can speak in French, so can I.